Thank you again for joining us for the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum's virtual lecture series, Talking About Race Matters, Join the Conversation. My name is Caroline McCarthy, and I'm the Director of Community Engagement at the Farmhouse. Talking About Race Matters is a series that explores the topic of race throughout history, centering a different theme each season. Our goal throughout has been to encourage people to come together and engage in a conversation that can sometimes be uncomfortable. This session of Talking About Race Matters is a 3-week series centered around health and wellness. Our presenters have and will continue to explore these topics, beginning with the period of enslavement in the United States and connecting the themes to present day. During the lecture, if you have any questions for the speaker, please use the Q&A function and we will get to those questions at the end. We would like to thank you all for attending today, and we would also like to sincerely thank this year's Talking About Race Matters sponsor, TD Bank. So finally, I'm excited to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Andrea Mosterman. Dr. Mosterman is an associate professor, Joseph Tragle Endowed Professor in Early American History, and graduate coordinator at the University of New Orleans. Today, she is presenting I Was Their Midwife, Pregnancy, Childbirth, and Motherhood on 17th-Century Slave Ships. So without further ado, welcome to Dr. Andrea Mosterman.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for having me in sharing some of my research on the slave ship the Gideon, and in particular here, the experiences of enslaved women, pregnancy, motherhood, and childbirth on 17th-century slave ships. Before I pull up my slides, I just want to note that this is a difficult topic to talk about. It's a difficult topic also to hear about, as is any topic that concerns the history of enslavement. But I just want to, make everybody aware that I think in particular, because this is dealing with children and pregnancy and motherhood, it's especially difficult in parts. So just as a warning. I also have some slides that are black. So if you don't see any image at some point, then that's because I did not think there was any appropriate image to share with you. So it does not mean that the slides are not working or anything went wrong. It just means that I'm leaving that blank. So let me pull up my slides. So this presentation, it really comes out of, or this research really comes out of my research on the slave ship the Gideon, which was a ship that arrived in New Amsterdam in 1664, just a few weeks before the English would take over the colony and rename it New York. One of the things that I'm trying to do is reconstruct the voyage of that ship, as well as the experiences of the people on board it, both the enslaved as well as the free people who were running this ship and saving the people on board the ship. Now, one of the questions then that I had, and let me actually share with you real quickly a little bit about the Gideon. So it arrived with 290 people still alive on board the ship when it arrives in New Amsterdam. It traveled from the Netherlands to West Africa, Central Africa, Curacao, and then eventually 300 people were transported from Curacao to New Amsterdam, 290 of whom survived that voyage. And this is the bill of lading of those of that ship in Curacao with those 300 people, and you can see it underlined. This is the captain, this is the ship, the Gideon, and here it says 300 enslaved people. So as I was trying to reconstruct the history and the experiences of people on board this ship, I turned to journal of a barber surgeon named Johann Oettinger, and he's one of the few people who actually gives us some insights into what was happening on these ships during the 17th century. He traveled on several Dutch ships as well as German ships. Now, one of these ships was the Dutch West India Company ship, the Juffrouw Alida, which arrived in Suriname in March of 1689. Oettinger recorded in his journal about this voyage that the number of enslaved men, women, and children who had survived the voyage from Curacao, including the 3 children they had gained underway. So this was a voyage from Curacao to Suriname. So he then explained that the birth of these children that they had gained underway was very well known to him because he was, as he wrote, their midwife. His casual mention of childbirth on board this 17th century Dutch slave ship stood out to me when I first read this journal. How would women have dealt with pregnancy, childbirth, and mothering during the transatlantic voyages? The fact that this notation somehow stunned me underscores how little has been written about the day-to-day experiences of the women held captive on such Dutch slavers, both by contemporaries and by historians. Now, ships are usually seen as masculine spaces, and slave ships are no exception. But as the Slave Voyages database shows, about a fourth of the captives transported on board 17th and 18th century Dutch slavers were in fact women. And women made up about 30% of all people trafficked in 17th century transatlantic voyages. On some of these ships, women were the majority. Indeed, as Jennifer Morgan points out, on a 1642 voyage of the Dutch ship Princess, 98% of the enslaved were women. Similarly, women made up 54% of the people on board the St. Jan, which shipwrecked before it reached Curacao in 1659. Yet we still know very little about the women on board these slavers. So influenced by the work of, among others, Sawan Mustaqim, Saidia Hartman, Stephanie Smallwood, and Jennifer Morgan, I explore women's experiences on these 17th century human trafficking voyages. Very few 17th century records discuss these slaving voyages as experienced by African captives, and reconstructing women's experiences proves especially challenging. As one colleague once noted, the Dutch don't have an Olada Equiano. What's more, there are no such accounts for the 17th century, and there are none at all written by women who survived the transatlantic slave trade. Now, that does not mean, however, that historians should not try to tell their stories, or that it is impossible to do so. So in this paper, I focus on a few examples to expand our understanding of women's experiences on board these ships. I will pay special attention to pregnancy, childbirth, and motherhood. Now, because of the limited number of sources, this paper does include examples from 17th century German and English ships in addition to Dutch ships. Close readings of these texts reveal that the circumstances on these ships were very similar. Plus, some of the people involved in the trade regularly moved from Dutch to other European slavers and vice versa. The barber surgeon on board the Juffrouw Alida, for instance, worked on both Dutch and German ships. As such, I believe that these examples can be used to reconstruct the experiences of women on 17th century Dutch ships. In fact, I think it's necessary to cast this wide net when trying to tell a history of women and motherhood. So let me start with another notation from Oettinger's journal. A Mooress kills her small child and throws it into the sea. That is all the barber surgeon wrote about this mother who took her child's life on board the Brandenburger African-American Company's vessel, Friedrich Wilhelm von Brandenburg. He did not detail who this woman was or what may have caused her to kill her child. These circumstances were irrelevant to the barber surgeon. He was merely recording the daily events, diseases, and casualties on board the slave ship. We can only imagine what led this mother to such a desperate act. Now, she and her child had been purchased by the company together with hundreds of others in Ouida between March 15th and April 4th of 1693. And you can see the location of Ouida here and what today is Benin. They had likely been captured in regional warfare. In Ouida, Oettinger expected them from head to toe to determine that they were of good health. To finalize their purchase, the chief factor burned the company's initials, CABC, into the skin of their right shoulder. They were then locked up until the company completed 8 to 100 similar purchases, after which they were marched from the town of Savi to the coast, tied with ropes, as Oettinger wrote, like horses. There, they would have been taken to the ship, where they were held with over 700 other captives, all stripped naked. On the ship, death and disease was evident all around them. While still anchored, 10 captives died of dysentery, and according to Oettinger, many others were ill. A number of enslaved men who were chained to each other on the ship's deck jumped into the sea. Before they could make it to shore, 2 of them were attacked by sharks that, as Oettinger detailed, tore away at arms and legs, as well as the head and the whole body, so greedily that blood spurted into the air. Did the woman and her child witness the horrific death of these men? Did they know them? Within a day of the ship's departure, 5 more people enslaved on the ship died, their bodies thrown into the sea. In subsequent days, many of the enslaved were sick with filthy sores, Oettinger wrote, and several more passed away. During these early days of the voyage, the seas were rough as they experienced several severe storms, undoubtedly causing seasickness among the captives. It was at this time that this mother took her child's life. What was she to do in a situation where her child was surrounded by violence, fear, death, and disease? Perhaps her child was ill, like so many others. Or maybe she struggled to feed it as her supply ran low due to stress and malnourishment. Or she may have despaired after having lost people close to them, either during capture and enslavement in West Africa or while on the ship. This may have been her way to protect her child from further suffering by trying to shield it from the horrors of the slave trade. Now, this mother was among the many women who had to care for children while they were held captive on European slave ships. Mothers who cared for little children would have had to find ways to provide for them, shield them from mental and physical trauma as best as they could, all while they struggled to keep themselves alive and sane, all while having no idea where they were going or what would happen to them or their children. Perhaps this is why one woman on the English slaver James, according to the records, being very fond of her child, carrying her up and down, wore her to nothing, by which means fell into fever and died. This mother exhausted herself, trying to comfort her child. Surely, she was one of many who gave all they could to protect their children during these transatlantic passages. Now, the fact that this mother had been able to move back and forth with the child, and that the mother on board the Friedrich Wilhelm von Brandenburg had been able to dispose of her child's body, shows that these women had some freedom of movement on board these ships. There's only limited information about the spatial organization of 17th-century slave ships, and the surviving records rarely mention where enslaved women were held. More is known about the 18th century, but records do suggest that the circumstances on their 17th century counterparts, especially those ships that were solely intended for the transportation of enslaved people across the Atlantic, that they were very similar to their 18th century counterparts. And here is an image of an 18th century French ship that actually details where the enslaved women were held, which is not usually detailed to that extent. And that was, in fact, in by number 7, this area, as well as 9, so right here. Now, the records that have survived detail that on 17th century slavers, women and men were held in separate areas, even if the exact organization varied. Willem Bosman, chief merchant for the Dutch West India Company in West Africa, suggested that on Dutch ships, their lodging place is divided into 2 parts, one of which is appointed for the men, the other for the women, each sex being kept apart. Here they lie as close together as is possible for them to be crowded, he wrote. Now, according to the Frenchman Jean Barbeau, employee of the Compagnie du Sénégal, European slavers had the men standing in the hold tied to stakes, the women between decks, and those that are with child in the great cabin, and the children in the steerage. Even during meals, for which men and women were often brought on deck, they remained segregated. In his description of the voyage of the English slaver Hannibal, Thomas Phillips, commander of the said ship, explained that while the men ate on the deck and forecastle, where they were held under command of our arms from the quarterdeck, the women would eat upon the quarterdeck with us. Because these women were considered less threatening, they were less often chained and surveilled. Indeed, women often had more physical mobility on these slavers. In fact, several Dutch historians have suggested that women's relative mobility on these ships may have been the reason for lower mortality amongst enslaved women than men. Still, the women held captive on board were often restricted to hot, leaky, and cramped spaces with low ceilings below deck, especially at night. During the Friedrich Wilhelm von Brandenburger's transatlantic voyage, for instance, the enslaved women all lay together on the floor below deck, naked. According to Oettinger, they woke up the ship's crew when they were screaming frightfully in the middle of the night because of the seawater that was spraying in through the planks on their naked bodies. Such circumstances would not have been unusual on other 17th century slave ships. During the day, these women may have been able to access the deck more regularly, and they often helped with, among others, food preparation. And this is actually visible on an image of this 18th century Danish slave ship, where you can see, when you zoom in on this part, you can see actually women working on preparing the food. Now, women had more freedom to move around the ship than men because they were considered less of a threat to the crew. But as some historians have pointed out, women often proved instrumental in shipboard revolts. Take, for example, the role of women in the successful revolt on board the slave ship Creole. A woman also appeared responsible for the destruction of the English slaver Dorothy, which blew up in 1683. According to testimony, a woman had been seen with a lighted pipe of tobacco just before the fire started. She flung the same pipe lighted from her, which then fell in the hole of the said ship, where the powder was, and instantly the ship thereupon was blown up. Could it be that this woman used her knowledge of the ship and relative freedom of movement to set the ship ablaze? According to David Richardson, quantitative data shows that ships on which revolts occurred had proportionately more women than normal among their captives. He hypothesizes that women's involvement may have been the result of their mobility, and them usually being located closer to the officers' quarters as well as to the weapons store. Certainly, women used their access on these ships to resist their captivity. But more mobility on these slavers was not the only thing that made women's experiences on these ships differ from that of the men. Women would have experienced sexual violence, pregnancy, and childbirth during these forced transportations. The Dutch West India Company ship, Juffrouw Alida, had arrived in Curaçao in September of 1688 after a 2-month-long Atlantic voyage from Texel in the Netherlands. Now, at the time, Curaçao was a booming slave depot where Dutch ships yearly brought thousands of enslaved men, women, and children for transshipment to other, predominantly Spanish-American regions. In Curaçao, these people would be forced off the ship and transported to the island's various so-called seasoning camps, where they were held until they could be sold elsewhere. And you can see these on this map of Curaçao. So it's really during this period that those camps, also referred to as slave pens, were developed, and that this trade was really, that Curaçao was really developed into this slave depot to then transport and save people to other parts of the Americas. So you can see here on this map of Curaçao, here the area of Willemstad, and these are 2 of those slave pens. And this, of course, is the location of Curaçao in the Caribbean, very close to many of the Spanish colonies in that area, which was why it was such an ideal location for transshipment to other parts of the Americas. So many of these enslaved people would be taken off the ship in Curaçao, and there they would be held at these camps. Yet many of them perished within weeks of arrival, so they never actually were sold anywhere else, because the conditions on board of the slave ships that had brought them there had destroyed their bodies beyond repair. Now, in these seasoning camps, newly arrived Africans would be inspected for their age and health. Those who were considered a full pieza de India in the Spanish slave markets, those between 15 and 36 years old who had no health problems or disabilities, would eventually be transported to other predominantly Spanish colonies. Those who were too old, young, or weak to count as a full pieza de India, the so-called mancaron or macron, would remain in Curaçao, be sold as contraband, or be sent to other Dutch colonies like Suriname or New Netherlands. So enslaved families and loved ones who had survived the transatlantic passage together were regularly separated in Curaçao and sent to various colonies across the Americas, making any chance of reuniting impossible. Now, the nature of the expanding Dutch slave trade shaped the experiences of the men, women, and children who were trafficked. They would be transported on several ships and be passed on by various merchants before they reached a final destination. Extensive periods of transit in European hands could easily take over a year and often occurred in extreme circumstances. These many passages took an extreme toll not just on their physical, but also their emotional health. It was under these circumstances that the 3 pregnant women who were forced aboard the Juffrouw Alida, according to the ship's barber surgeon, the men, women, and children on the ship were all meron, that is, damaged or sickly. As visible pregnant women, they too were considered unwanted for the Spanish markets. They had likely arrived in Curaçao not long before the West India Company ship departed from the island. Perhaps they were among the 146 African captives who had been transported there from Ardra on the ship Sarah and Maria. Or they may have arrived on board the Eendracht, which arrived from North Congo a few months before the Juffrouw Alida left Curaçao. Together with 417 others, they were now being shipped to Suriname, where they and their newborn babies would be sold for sugar. In his journal, Johan Oettinger detailed the voyage. He also shared the number of people they eventually sold in Suriname when he wrote, and I quote, "On the 19th of the same month, the last were sold, and of them on the voyage, 83 men and women died and were cast into the sea, and 333 sold for sugar on land, not counting the children, of which we gained 3 underway. This was very well known to me because I was their midwife." Now, Oettinger follows this casual mentioning of these children's births with a then common description of childbirth among African women, writing, "The mother lies in no childbed. Instead, she walks straight away like a cat does with its young. But they also have no bed. Instead, they lie on the ground. They bind the child on their back with an old linen cloth, throw their breasts to him over the shoulder, and let them suckle. They look like a pair of young apes." Now here, he repeated common racist tropes, but failed to provide an actual discussion of these women or their specific circumstances as pregnant and laboring women on board a slave ship. Due to this lack of information, their experiences can only be guessed. We don't know their names. We don't know where they were from or where and under what circumstances they conceived. Considering the length of their journey, these pregnancies may have been the result of rape in slave pens or slave ships. Indeed, enslaved women regularly experienced such sexual violence during the various stages of their forced transportation. Pregnancy takes an incredible toll on a woman's body and mind under any circumstance. So I can't help but wonder how these women handled these pregnancies when struggling to stay alive themselves. Undoubtedly, they must have bonded over their shared experience. Did the pregnant women all stay in the great cabin where women with child were usually housed, according to Jean Barbeau? Although Oettinger claims he was their midwife, the women who gave birth on board this ship undoubtedly assisted each other during pregnancy and labor. And what happened when there were complications? In a journal kept by Peter Blake, who was commander of the English Royal Company ship the James during its 1675-1676 voyage, one woman died 2 days after she miscarried. According to Blake, the child had been dead within her and rotten. Were the ship's barber surgeons equipped to handle such medical emergencies? So let me return to New Amsterdam. On May 29th, 1664, the West India Company in New Amsterdam auctioned a mother and child to the highest bidder. Together with 39 others, they had arrived 2 days earlier on board the ship the Mus. The fact that the mother and child had been able to remain together suggests that the child was still very young and perhaps even an infant. Mothers of older children were regularly separated from their children in the slave pens of Curaçao. Now, the auction record referred to them only as a negress with a child. And you can see it right here, underlined, 360 guilders. Who was this woman? What was her name? Where was she from? Other than this notation, we know nothing about her or her child. The West India Company officials and Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam cared only about them as commodities, goods to be traded. Yet these were the rare traces of people whose stories would be lost. Not just their experiences, but their whole complex beings reduced to a negress with a child. The Saidia Hartman addresses the silences in the archives when she writes, "Here is the same fate as every other Black Venus. No one remembered her name or recorded the things she said, or observed that she refused to say anything at all. Here is an untimely story told by a failed witness." Dutch merchants, settlers, company officials, captains, sailors, barber surgeons, and accountants were all failed witnesses. Yet, every now and then, the records do provide glimpses into their lives, and historians can use those rare moments, like the births that were recorded by Oettinger, to tell some of these stories. And that's it. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions and continuing the conversation, and I will stop sharing now.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you for this presentation. I will remind our participants, if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A function. So our first question is, thank you for a powerful and sensitive presentation. How can we find out more about the ship Dorothy and the revolt on board?
I can tell you, maybe not right on the spot, but I can send you, if you're interested, I can send you the records where this is mentioned. It actually is available online. It's in a book that's like archives.org or something. And so if you're interested, send me an email and then I'll send you the footnotes, because I have it here. I just don't want to like go looking through my papers, but I'd be happy to share it. And it should be easy enough to access.
Great, thank you. So our next question is asking about midwifery among enslaved women, and are there records of enslaved women as midwives?
Yes, there are, but I don't know of any of them on like 17th century Dutch ships, which is what I have looked at in particular. But there are some people working on this. And actually, Camilla de Koning is a Dutch scholar who very recently published a book with Carvan Fatta Black on this among other topics. So if you're interested, I do believe it may be in Dutch, but it is a very interesting collection of essays, and one in particular focuses on this topic. And there are other scholars working on it. So it kind of depends on what, if we're thinking about it more in terms of like the plantation South or the Caribbean, then there's a lot more evidence. But if we're talking about the slave ships, then it's a little bit harder to get some of that evidence, especially for the 17th century. But
Yeah,
there's stuff out there. Also for the Dutch in the 18th century, there's stuff out there which they have used in their book.
great. So kind of building on what you were just discussing, this person is asking what led you to delve into this research and how difficult has it been to find sources on this topic?
Yeah. So it really is, like I said at the beginning, it's because of this ship that I'm working on, the Gideon, which to me, I came across that ship when I was working on my book on enslavement and resistance in Dutch New York, because this was the second largest number of enslaved people brought into North America by the Dutch. And it's an extraordinary number on all accounts, not just for the Dutch, but in general into North American harbors. Usually the numbers were much smaller. So this was really kind of part of this these developing efforts by the Dutch to turn slave trading itself, like the trafficking of human beings, into a business. So whereas previously they would be transporting people to, for example, Brazil in large numbers or other colonies when they were their colonies, so that these people could labor there. They now, in the 17th century, the second part of the 17th century, were really focusing on transporting people to sell them, to make money off of the selling of people. And especially the Spanish were considered like this important, very profitable market to sell enslaved people to. And so the Gideon was an example of that, and part of those developments. And so I was really interested in that when I was working on my book, and that's how I started that research now already many years ago. One of the things that I'm particularly interested in is really looking at the experiences of people who are involved in the slave trade, both the people who are actually working in the slave trade, as well as the people who were forced on these ships, transported, trafficked by these people. And that's how I came upon the journal by Johan Oettinger, which, by the way, is translated and published. So if anybody is interested in reading that, it's quite remarkable, and it has a really long but like very good introduction by the people who discovered that journal and who translated it. So it's a very useful source in kind of thinking about the slave trade, especially the Dutch and the German slave trade in the latter part of the 17th century. So that's how I came upon those references. And in all honesty, I was kind of taken aback by it because I never really thought through that there would be women pregnant and giving birth on these slave ships. When we talk about the transatlantic slave trade and we see images of it, so often it is very male dominated. And and so that's where, it really piqued my interest, as in, like, what else could I discover about the experiences of women and mothers on this ship. And that is how I was able, to kind of piece things together and tell some of these stories. And so they're not of the Gideon itself, but they are, because there are so few sources, they help me also understand kind of what were the circumstances more generally on these slave ships. Sorry, I know you were going to say something.
Oh, it's okay. No worries. Thank you. That's fantastic. So, now we have some audience members wondering, what's next for you in this research and where do you go from here?
Mm-hmm. So I'm continuing to research the Gideon and this voyage. I actually believe that this is kind of part of Dutch efforts to really expand the slave trade into North America, and that they were important actors in kind of turning, really advancing racial slavery in North America, something we really see accelerating in the latter part of the 17th century. And so I believe that that really starts with these Dutch efforts to expand the slave trade into North America. So it's a book on the Gideon, on that ship, but really as an example and kind of like trying to tell that larger story of the transatlantic slave trade into North America. And so that's what I've been working on for many years now, and I'll likely continue to work on for a little while longer, because these things just take a very long time. But I think they are, I mean, I always research where I can't find answers by looking at other people's work. And that's kind of what happened here, where everybody would mention the Gideon, but nobody really expanded on it. And that's the same with the experiences of these enslaved women. In case of the Dutch, there's been work in other, in the 18th century, especially like the English trade, but there's very little of that on the Dutch. So yeah, that's kind of how I work my way through my topics and decide what to work on, and that's what I'm working on now.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I want to thank you all for attending, and thank you again, Dr. Andrea Mosterman, for this fantastic discussion. I hope everyone enjoyed this talk. If you missed one of the presentations of this series, please visit our website or YouTube channel to watch a recording. And please consider making a donation to the Dyckman Farmhouse to enable us to continue to offer free public programming. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.